Well, welcome to the Media Society's first in-person event since COVID. So we are delighted to have you all here. And we can't think of a more fitting place to have it and a place to partner with, because the motto here is gathering, I can't even read my writing now, gathering change makers. All right, and so we are delighted. We thank the Conduit very much for partnering with us, and we're delighted that everybody can join in this fantastic space. So I'm Susan Morton. I'm Vice President of the Media Society, and I'm honoured to see each and every one of you alongside Alex Sinker, who is my co-producer for tonight. Now, the Media Society exists to offer critical discourse, and it would help if I put my glasses on, an examination of the pivotal issues shaping British media life. We are immensely proud of the debates we facilitate, and tonight's conversation is no exception. We're here to tackle a vital subject, the influence and impact of the media on women in sports. At a time when unprecedented number of fans are engaging with women's sports, we aim to delve into the role the media plays in propelling gender equality in the world of sports and beyond. Now, the Conduit was formed, if you like, on Ubuntu, and that means humanity to others. And it reminds us that I am because of who we all are. So I think it's really apt that we are looking at this topic tonight to see how collectively we are shaped and our views are shaped by what the media says. Tonight we are delighted to have a fantastic panel of speakers, and I would like to introduce you to Sue Thearle, who is was the first female reporter for Match of the Day, and she will introduce the rest of the panel. Just to give you an idea of the way of tonight's events, we will be having about an hour's discussion, after which there will be questions. Please feel free to raise your hands. We will be coming around with mics, or ask myself or Alex, and we will be coming around. If you don't want to ask the question, we can ask it for you. And after that, there will be drinks and time for you to mingle and meet the presenters. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Sue. Please give a round of applause to our panel for their time.
Susan, thank you very much indeed. Very warm welcome to all of you. As Susan said, we are going to do a panel discussion of about 15 minutes to an hour, and then the floor will be open to questions for about half an hour. So please do write down anything that you feel you want to squirrel away and test our panel with nice, tasty questions a little bit later on, or anything else you want to explore in a bit more detail that maybe we haven't had time to cover in that hour up here on the stage. So without any further ado, let me introduce my panel. It's a cracking panel for you tonight to discuss the rise of women's sport and where it goes from here, and why the rise has taken place in the manner that it has, which I think you'd agree over the last certainly 10 years or so, it's been quite a phenomenal rise. So looking down the list of people we have today, on the left-hand side down there is Ali Bowe. She is a senior lecturer in sociology and sport at Nottingham Trent University, specialising in women's sport and the media. Ali, you are very welcome. I'll ask you to clap them all at the end, if you don't mind. Next to her is Sue Anstis MBE, who has been an advocate par excellence for women's sport down the years. And I hope some of you have seen her Netflix documentary, Game On, The Unstoppable Rise of Women's Sport. She's got plenty of things to say and a perfect guest for us as well. And Owen Slott is next to me as well. Very welcome too. Chief sports writer for The Times. So he has seen an awful lot in the... How many years is it now, Owen?
At The Times, 21 years.
21 years. First question, first difficult question of the night, put away there by Owen very nicely indeed. So please give them all a nice round of applause. Now, Sue, I'm going to start with you because your documentary is remarkable. It's a fantastic watch. It's an emotional watch for women like myself who've been involved for sport for a very, very long time. Is it an unstoppable rise, women's sport at the moment?
That's a good question to start with. I do feel it is. I feel with lots of things in history, it's a bit of a stop-start. I think things move on very rapidly and then we tend to fall back a little. But I feel from the years I've been involved in women's sport, it does feel, even the last, as you say, the last 2-3 years, since 2019 really, I do feel we've gone far enough that we won't go back again. I don't like the phrase tipping point, but I do feel we've gone past that in terms of the growth of women's sport and the coverage.
Well, let's just contextualise that, because in terms of the achievements, obviously being parochial a little bit to start off with in terms of English and British women's sport, we had England as the Cricket World Champions in 2017 with a near record attendance at Lord's. The Red Roses, who I know you're particularly fond of following, made the Women's Rugby World Cup final last year. Obviously, last year was an unbelievable year for women's football with the Euros success. This year, they've backed it up by going all the way to the World Cup final. The tennis players, Team GB, made the semi-finals of the Billie Jean King Cup. I was in the final this year in Seville, just this weekend, actually. Unfortunately, they didn't make it there, but they were semi-finalists last year. When you put all of that together, combined with record audiences and record TV audiences as well, that's quite a list of honour, isn't it?
Yeah, it does, and I love the way that one impacts the other. I do think there's that domino effect of we see success in one sport or even across one country. I do believe the success we've seen, you said parochially in the UK, but it does then ripple out to other countries, both across sports but across media too. So yeah, I do feel it's hard not to be proud of what the British women are doing and the success they're having and the impact that definitely has. People do love to follow winning teams.
They certainly do. Owen, I'm going to pick on you slightly at the start.
Don't pick on me.
I'm going to slightly pick on you, only because one of the things I just said to Sue was about the TV coverage, and the media coverage in the radio as well has been fantastic. I think you would agree that the newspapers are a little bit behind that in terms of the way they've covered women's sport most recently and over the years.
No, I don't think we're a little bit behind. I think we're way behind, actually. I have to say I'm sort of kind of representing newspapers here, so I would love to be an advocate of the way we cover what we cover, but I can't say I feel particularly proud of how we've covered women's sport over decades, and I think we're dragging ourselves really slowly into the field of play, if you like. I write for the Times, which is certainly not the market leader. The market leader is the Guardian and the Telegraph, and we make the decisions to cover women's sport the way we do. I've actually just got a new sports editor in the last week, so I'm kind of hoping that my conversation with him might be slightly different. But as the chief sports writer of the Times, I feel it's really important that I should be at big women's sports events. Like I lobbied to go to the Football World Cup in the summer, and my sports editor was kind of like, "Oh, really? Do you think you should be at that? Because the Premier League season's going to start, and you might miss the start of that." And so those are the sort of conversations we had. I did go to the Women's Football World Cup, and I flipping loved it. But we've been so far behind, and
why?
Well, the simple reason for that is, and it's a far clearer reason now, is because we don't think that we get readers, and now that we can see what every reader or subscriber does when they click on a website, we can tell you exactly how valuable our women's coverage is. And so the balance that we have to deal with, and the decisions we have to make are, if we cover lots of women's sport, that the numbers tell us, the metrics show that we don't get as many readers. I mean, by a considerable distance. So we have to make the decision, how important is it that we cover this women's event versus that man's event, where we feel we want to support women's sport because we believe in it. And I think our ethics within us are okay, but we don't make the business decisions, versus do we cover men's events where we know there's a bigger audience waiting. Now, obviously, this is the unstoppable rise of women's sport. So if we just go, oh, well, we're not going to get very many readers, or users, then we're not going to bother, then we will never develop the audience. So the conversation is how much do you invest now in the hope that you'll be building up an audience in the future.
Ali, perhaps you could speak a little bit, you're perfectly qualified to do this, I know, in terms of the gender imbalance in women's sport down the years, the roots of it, and the battle, if you will, against it over the last decade or so, which has intensified.
I mean, how long has everyone got for that question, right? I mean, I think most people in this room that are interested in the media coverage of women's sport are probably well versed in some of those kind of long historical discussions that have been had about the perpetual subordination of women's sport. So I guess when you look at the whole ecosystem of sport and you go right back to the start of where we start to see formalised codified sport, I think you have to align how sport originated with how the position that women held in society more broadly. I think the two have always gone hand in hand. So the start of formal organised sport was very much in the realms of men's sport, and women just did not have a space there, or when they did, it was very hidden. And I think in more recent years we've started to see those kind of hidden histories, hidden voices around women's sport, and the story has always been one of women having to kind of prove themselves, fight to get space in on pitches, in newspapers, etc. So it definitely that story is mirrored across any aspect of sport. I think this one of women that have always been on the back foot, and it is very rooted in all kind of the history books. Sports historians, sports sociologists will let us know that is very rooted in just the kind of societal positioning of women more broadly, and that's something that I think is contributing to the unstoppable rise of women's sport as we see sort of changes more broadly in society. But it's definitely there's a hangover of that, I think, that we see everywhere.
But there is no doubting the cultural, socio impact of greater prominence to women's sport and the crossover of that. We've seen it just recently, haven't we, at Wimbledon with the introduction, it seems ridiculous to say it after so many years, of different colour underwear so women don't feel uncomfortable if it's their period. That's led to greater conversations about menstrual cycles in sport, and out with of that, the menopause at the other end of a woman's biological lifespan in terms of reproductively. So it's remarkable in a way that element has taken this long, but that's just underlines how important it can be.
Yes, definitely. I think some of those issues you raised are really interesting because as I said, it kind of is across the whole ecosystem. So some of the discussions that we have in kind of research terms, there's been some research that's been done that's kind of unpicked the whole field of sports science. And that research has shown that what we know about the field of sports science, which is a huge kind of body of work in academia, that 6% of research studies have been done on female athletes. So it's not like this is a systemic problem from the world of sport, no matter where you look at it, whether that's media coverage as the focus today, whether that's what we know about women's sport. And that comes down to, I guess, who's making those decisions. And I don't think that often is like conscious decisions that have been to, I don't know, make decisions on behalf of women that are not female friendly, let's say. But I think it's not having a lens or not having a worldview that someone goes, oh, isn't it strange that women might feel uncomfortable wearing white undershorts or decisions such as that. So yeah, it's definitely a systemic issue, I think, that is now being paid attention to, and we can start to resolve that.
Sue, I know this is a subject on which you are very passionate. What's your viewpoint?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, definitely, you talk about the whites, but just generally about women's sports clothing. And the more I research and when I do talks at universities and I share the pictures of the athletics team, male and female, and the gymnastics team, male and female, and the Norwegian handball, etc. And it's like when you see them up there on the screen, you think, oh, how can that be? It's 2023. How can women be playing in those tiny, really objectified clothes versus the men in the era that we're in? So for me, I think it's really important that we talk about it because it isn't just about sport. That I love women's sport, I love sport, but for me it's that bigger piece of how it then impacts outwards to society. So everything that Ali says in terms of how society has impacted women's sport and made it be where it is today, for me, I'm really excited about the growth and the profile and, you know, celebrating these amazing female athletes and how that then impacts women and girls and boys and men and their views of women and their respect for women in all roles within life too. So that's a really powerful piece for me.
Well, this is where language, I think, and the way that women's sport in broadcast media, written media is portrayed is so important. And now I want to give you a cracking example. You have to only go back to 1989 to just discuss this a little bit further. The Whitbread round the world yacht race, Tracy Edwards and her all-female crew, her first female crew, in the race, and this is how the papers reported it. That's 19...
Which is that from? Do you know?
It's,
Senior yachting correspondent at the time.
okay.
Worked for the Guardian.
The Guardian, okay. A senior yachting correspondent, that's how
Knew
he
it would be
used.
the Guardian.
Yeah. That's how he used to describe them. So, of course, and they were asked on television afterwards, I think it was by Fern Britton, who's a bit of a hero of mine because she came from my part of the world down in the southwest. They were asked on national television if they were going to be okay with not having or going to wear waterproof mascara. So that was the level of editorial questioning that was thrown at them. So that's only 1989, and Owen, I'll start with you. Language matters, representation matters in the way that something is represented, and we have come a long way since that, haven't we?
Yeah, I think so. I hope so. But I'm just not surprised about that because so much of the way that sport has been covered over decades, so women's sport has been covered over the decades, is not so much about their sport, but about women's sport, but about the fact that it's people from a different gender who are doing this. I mean, can you believe it? There are some women who are sailing in a sailing competition. I mean, that's what that says. It's not. It doesn't say if they've done well or not. It says, isn't this a shock that some women are doing this? And that's one of the things that we that I think newspapers and the media generally are too slowly getting to, is the point where we cover women's sport for the sake of sport rather than the fact that we're talking about gender differences, or isn't it amazing that there's a women's team who are doing really well. I mean, Rachel Blackmore, the jockey, for instance, probably gets more coverage for the fact that she's a woman than she's won the Grand National and done amazing things. That's still the case. That's her standout feature. And I don't know what everyone thinks it's a wonderful thing to celebrate the first woman ever to win the Grand National. So you shouldn't not be saying that, recording that's history, but that's also the story.
One of the sports that fascinates me, and you covered it a lot in your documentary, Sue, was women's rugby. Now, and the attitudes to that. We'll talk about women's football in a second. I can speak to that because I used to play women's football. In fact, I started playing women's football at the age of 10 in the playground at my primary school in Cornwall, and I was better than all the boys. And although I say so myself, I was. And the headmaster spotted it and put me in the team. And so this was not long after the FA's 50-something year ban on women's football being banned. It was banned, can you believe that? Because too many people were going to watch it after the First World War, and the men thought, we're not having that, so they can't play. So we weren't allowed to play. Anyway, he put me in the team. I scored a very good volley, though I say so myself, in the first match. And in the second, I scored again. And after that second match, the parent of the boy who'd been left out of the team for me to be put in complained vociferously. So I was taken out of the team. And it irritated me, and it still irritates me now. His name was Sean Taylor. It's not his fault. And I get it. As a parent, I get it, because, you know, I can't say that in that time, if I'd been his mum, I wouldn't have been the same. I can't say that. But it does just show how much attitudes have changed over the years, and they certainly have. And so that is what gave me the absolutely furious desire to get into the media and work on football and all sorts of other sports, which I did. But that was the moment where I thought, the world isn't fair, and I don't understand why it's not fair. But it's certainly balancing up now. There's no doubt about that. But I go back to women's rugby. Sorry, Sue, that was a slight detour. The way women's rugby is portrayed is fascinating, isn't it? And attitudes towards it, because in women's football, I feel 10 years ago, the attitude was, okay, well, one or two of them can play, but they're rubbish, really. Then about 5 years ago, it was like, okay, well, now 3 or 4 of them can play, but the goalkeepers are crap. And now it's like, oh, they can all play. So no one talks about it in a way that they used to 10 years ago, but with women's rugby, we're not in that same space, are we?
No, I feel we're progressing and moving. I was just going to reflect on that whole attitude of parents. When I first started working, I used to run a PR agency, and I started working with the RFU, and I met Alex Teasdale, who was head of women's rugby at the time, and I had 3 daughters who, none of them were playing rugby at the time, so it's maybe 10 years ago, and she said, oh, would you want your daughters to play rugby? And I said, well, I would do, but maybe touch or tag. I wouldn't want them to play contact rugby, and that's me in this world of women's sport. And actually, 2 of them went on to play, and one played quite high level through the Wasps Academy, etc. So so she often reminds me, even my journey of my attitude to sport, having been at Loughborough when you were at Bristol, Alex was setting up women's rugby at Bristol in the 80s, and I was at Loughborough not playing rugby. But I had my own unconscious bias around the physicality of women's rugby, and now I'm absolutely, as you say, a passionate fan of it, and the quality that you've seen, the progress, etc. too. So just reflect on that. I think we all need to recognise we all have our own unconscious bias. We might not like it, but it is a thing that's there. But I think in terms of the quality of play of rugby that is catching up, we've only been professional, the game's only been professional for less than the last decade, and that's your speciality area really in terms of the professionalism of women's sport. But sometimes we forget that improvement in play and the quality of play, and you couldn't watch WXV tournament, that's just taken place, the Rugby World Cup, the Premiership women's rugby starts this weekend, and not see this huge jump in terms of the quality of play. So I do feel rugby's it's not quite there where football is. It hasn't been professional as long, but it's definitely getting there.
This was, got another headline for you, 1991 when England's women got to the final of the Rugby World Cup. That was another Rugby World Cup year for the men. They got, England did as well, but this is how the women were portrayed in the newspaper. And Ali, I think that speaks to the gender imbalance discussion brilliantly, doesn't it? Because there's a discomfort with women playing rugby that shines through here, which is why they've tried to be feminised ridiculously in those pictures.
Absolutely. I think I'll speak in some regard to the kind of arguably extensive in the world of researching women's sport, but an extensive body of research that has looked at the language used by media to cover female athletes, and some of the things that have been picked up time and time again in any context, by the way. This is research from New Zealand, America, Australia, the UK, that highlights that during this period, even later. I was doing my PhD early 2010, like 2010, 11, 12. We were seeing sexualization of female athletes. Female athletes, you had to have the juxtaposition of women looking like women so that we could accept that they would look like athletes as well. So there's a real nuance to how the media felt they had to cover female athletes in this kind of overtly feminized way. They often talked about kind of partners. By partners, read kind of heterosexual partners, so boyfriends. I use it with my students, kind of loads of examples of where, even at Rio 2016, there was a couple of examples of female medal winners where their partners were the headline, which is ridiculous. One of the American shooting athletes was married to an NFL player, so the headline was about NFL player's wife wins bronze medal, swimmer's coach's husband. So these are things that we still see around the coverage. That was 2016 at
This
Rio.
is why I'm loving Taylor Swift going to Travis Kelce's games, because no one talks about him. They all talk about
exactly.
Tay-Tay.
It's like the reverse.
Exactly,
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
So that's a headline from the women in 1991. We've also got one from the Euros. So this is only 2011. So again, this is talking about the women's Euros to which England qualified. You can see Kelly Smith down there. That's Birgit Prince, who was an absolute superstar in women's football down in the right-hand side. But they've chosen to make prominent the Swedish lady on the right-hand side. And again, some of the language is quite remarkable. Law degrees, modest salaries, an England team that might just win. I mean, that's 12 years ago. So again, things have moved on a long way since then, but there's still a way to go. Oh, and the language is so important, isn't it? I mean, because often you talk about women's football or women's rugby or women's this or women's that, and it's just Rugby World Cup for the men, FIFA World Cup for the men. So that distinction almost makes it feel from the get-go like a poor relation.
I'm just worried you're going to pull up one of my cuttings.
Funny you should mention. I'm only joking.
Yeah, that's that's right. It is the women's Super League, and it's not the men's Premier League, and that's the way it is at the moment, and God knows how long that's going to be the case. I think that's a bigger piece that maybe comes down to branding, commercialism. You've got to, people want to know what they're watching, but yeah, the fact that women's professional sport is so often has that explainer with it. On the other hand, the sports that we're kind of maybe used to, but aren't, that sort of in the modern rise of professional sports. So, if you go to the Olympics, where women have been competing, catching up. Obviously, there were many sports they weren't allowed to compete in for a long time, etc. But you don't tend to see women's diving, for instance. You say diving, or women's swimming, whatever. But yeah, I think I don't know when that is going to when you're not going to have that prefix of what you're watching.
I was going to ask you, without putting you on the spot here, but what do the Times do in terms of your reporting on football? Would you ever say Chelsea men, Chelsea whatever, and then Chelsea women? What do you use in your language of reporting in the paper to distinguish between the women's cricket team or just the England team being the men's team? Do you have any guidelines in terms of how you use language?
Yeah, pretty much every time in the furniture, which is the sort of the headline or the words around the article, there will be something explaining that you're not going to read a men's story, you're going to read a women's story.
Wait, in terms of the men's story?
Would we do it the other way around? No, we don't say this is the Spurs men's team. No, we don't.
Would you ever consider, has that been discussed? Is that something you would, so I feel like I'm quizzing him here.
I'm
very happy to have this chance.
It's absolutely right, but you have to signpost to your readers where they're going. But at the same time, when we cover the Olympics, where we're comfortable and there's history, we don't get, as I say, we don't go.
I feel like the Olympics is not a separate category. That's been around. It's been equal forever. It's where we now have professional women's sports in places that were just men. So do you not feel the need to signpost their audience? Because obviously you're saying there aren't that many women reading, coming to those newspapers at the moment anyway, you would say, from your analysis.
So you want to tell people where they can go if they want to read that as well. So in a way, if you want to bring a new audience in to read about the Arsenal women's game, for instance, then you want to signpost them where to go. So it sort of works both ways.
It does. I guess I feel that by not delineating the male side of sport, it just always makes the men's sound like that is the ultimate, and then we've got the women's this and the women. That's how I feel when I.
No, I think you're right to feel that, and I would hope that maybe 10 years at some point down the line we've got to the point where we don't. But I feel it has to be there because people need to know their way around what they're going to access. But I don't think it's ideal, and in an equal world, of course, we wouldn't be doing that.
I think the BBC's doing more of it. I think if you look at BBC coverage now, it definitely will just let you know if it's male or female.
I think so. You were nodding. I was going to ask you, Ali, your thoughts on the language around the coverage of sports, women's sport.
I mean, I'm obviously. Not that it's Team Sue or Team Owen, but I would love to see. I think I agree with Owen. It's going to be a long time before you start to see women and men as the two descriptors. Okay, you're not going to see Arsenal men play football against Spurs men and probably beat them, but. I almost don't think it's necessarily just a media problem. This is like how we look at sport more broadly. I think rugby are doing something really interesting. They obviously rebranded the Rugby World Cup to be gender neutral, ungendered. And then for the sort of upcoming Rugby World Cups in the next 4 years, they have added men's and women's to the titles of that. And I think that's a really powerful move of saying, okay, well, we tried the non-gendered language and that didn't really work because people got a little bit confused with what World Cup we're talking about. So we're going to go with men and women because we value both competitions equally. That's what it's almost like the feel of it. Now I think there's the commercial discussion, like can Arsenal rebrand as Arsenal men? like the logic of it is like, no, of course not. We've got this 100 and however long year history of being called Arsenal FC. Like, it doesn't make any sense to put an M in there. But I do think our sports organisation is going to go, okay, we are going to be called Manchester United Men, and it will be a really powerful moment for demonstrating kind of gender equality agendas that we are going to precursor our men's and women's teams in the same way. I think Lewis FC does it. I think it's really powerful that they do it, but it's a long time coming, and I hope we will get there. I think that is encompassing like the powers of be that sport within sport as well as media in terms of how we use that language.
And is there research done, or is it something maybe that's going to be done in terms of how reductive it is to use the language that is used at the moment in terms of making women's sport feel like a second-class citizen?
Yes, absolutely. Some of the kind of research, particularly it centres mainly on media coverage, to be honest, but the research always picks up, we call it gender marking. So you'll look at media articles, print articles, online articles, and it's immediately obvious that it's a women's article, but if you looked at it with no pictures, maybe it wouldn't be obvious it's a men's article, so you don't have the kind of precursor of gender. So academics have written about that as kind of indicative of the hierarchy, of the positioning of women's sport as other, I guess, because we do have sport and women's sport. We don't often talk about men's sport, women's sport in the same way. So yeah, it's kind of a real bedrock, I guess, of some of the stuff that's written about in terms of media coverage of women's sport more broadly.
Sue, in terms of the coverage generally, we can talk a bit about the broadcast coverage if you would like. One of the things that made my heart sing last year when England won the Euros was that record crowd at Wembley, which wasn't just a record crowd for a women's football match, it was a record crowd for a Euros, any kind of match, at Wembley Stadium. What are your thoughts on the broadcast, how it's handled, how it's presented, and where you think that could improve? I'm not saying that anything is, no one can ever feel complacent, but it's expanded dramatically, hasn't it?
Yeah, and definitely. So that I think that coverage with Sky TV and BBC, that taking the WSL and some of the championship games to that massive audience, the fact that they came together on that deal and the quality of coverage. And for me, it isn't, obviously it's great that we've got the hours of coverage that are now out there, but for me it's the quality of production, it's the investment in the number of cameras, the captioning, the analysis, everything that goes with it, so it feels like a really high quality product. And I think that's been so important and has been lacking in the past. And I often, well, I'm a massive fan of rugby, by the time I'm watching games, how hard it's been for me to find it, and then you've got the wind blowing on 2 cameras from Loughborough where you're trying to watch a game and I can't even hear who's commentating. When you look at that and you compare to kind of where the football coverage is now getting to, it is fabulous. I think the free-to-air is really important. So I mentioned again the PWR starts this weekend, first game, Bristol Sale, but actually it's on TNT, it was BT Sport. So it's been a really big deal. First time there's funding coming in to the coverage of women's rugby in that way, but at the moment there isn't a free-to-air broadcast with that, and that's slightly disappointing. So I think the power of that Sky BBC deal for football to reach that massive audience, and Women's Sports Trust and a load of fabulous analysis of that audience, but really reaching those new numbers that you mentioned there.
Owen, what's your sense? We've had a little bit of a pop at newspapers so far, so I'm sorry for that.
Not
so
finished.
I'm going to give you a bit of an open goal now.
I was sort of welcoming it from the start. I kind of think we deserve it.
Yeah, well, what do you think of the
so
broadcast?
Stop now.
Oh yeah, I'm going to stop now. What do you think of the broadcast coverage? And, are there ways that you feel it's falling beneath the standard it should be meeting, or exceeding that standard? What do you think?
Well, I think the broadcast has the same issues that the written media do. So why are we not seeing more of the women's rugby being televised professionally, being on free to air? Because people are making the same decisions about how many people we think we're going to watch. So it's a commercial decision. So I would hope that sort of like the direction of travel is that in time we will get there. I think the broadcast generally is leading the way, but it sort of needs the newspapers and the written media to follow, and I think we're just going too slowly, as I said before.
What does your wife do, Owen? Tell the audience about your magnificent wife.
Oh, well, so I've got this wife right at home. But the word at home is pretty ineffective because she's the chief commercial officer at Arsenal. So if you want to know why Arsenal have sellouts fill our stadium better than any other WSL team for WSL games, then it's Mrs. Slott who's responsible for that. So. So we support that at home, but we have this conversation that follows that goes, so you get 50,000 people to go to watch an Arsenal game, an Arsenal women's game, but we were not saying Arsenal women's on, we were just saying Arsenal now. So we get 50,000 people to watch that, but at the same time we're going, how many of them are going to read the Times coverage of it the next day? And so where newspapers are going is we're going, well, hardly any of them will, because there's the culture of going to watch a sport and then read about it in this new world of women's football it doesn't exist yet. So we're trying to work out what to write to make people read the next day or to read the day before.
That's in a way, Ali, one of the most exciting things about the culture of women's sport and the way it's exploded so dramatically, because in a lot of the sport, and again I speak to this because I played women's football for a long time, that almost amateur semi-pro ethos was so welcoming, so engaging, such a safe space to be in. It's still managing to retain that up to a point, but when commercialism comes in more and more, and it will need the money of sponsors to grow more and more, that's going to be a difficult circle to square, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. I think it's conversations that lots of people are having, I think, about how does women's sport, women's football, women's rugby, how does it retain the bit that everyone already loves about it and become this new, bigger, better, mediatised, commercialised version that we also want it to be. I think that I guess it's a hard path to navigate for people involved in sports, such as your wife, Owen, and figuring out how you... I think one thing that's spoken about when I end up talking about kind of this process of professionalisation and what does it look like is how do you reimagine what that could be for women's football so it looks different to men's football or feels different and retains the bits that you've really grown to love about women's football, which I think for lots of people that have been fans of women's sport for a long time has been the kind of amateur ethos, and it has been that despite challenges and despite history and bans and whatever else, that women are still playing football and are still doing really well and are successful despite the challenges and not because of the support they now get. So I think that journey, for me anyway, and the stuff I write about, I think the journey and the history is so central and so integral to how we understand women's sport and what it was and then what it can be, that shouldn't get lost. And I do think that's a difficult one to navigate with kind of commercial priorities and business, etc. And that's not anything to do with that.
I was just going to say, we were at Leaders Week, Industry Summit, a couple of weeks ago, and every panel I heard talk about the future of sport talked about women's sport, and not just women on women's. Actually, Juliet was an amazing panellist, or had a keynote. But actually, other panels, so men from the US, from all over the world, talking about what's the future. The future, in terms of the commercial opportunity, is women's sport. So for me, that's really satisfying. Like, yeah, we've been telling you that for a decade. Like, happy days, you've woken up to it. But how exciting that we've seen this growth, but actually the cusp of truly embracing it in terms of the commercial potential and the opportunity. We're not really there yet, but you see it is in the distance, and people are beginning to wake up to that too.
But if you look at women's sportswear, for instance, 3 decades ago, it hardly existed on the shelves. Yeah. It was a strange category, and then in the 90s, I remember Adidas brought out a women's range, and it was like, really? And so that was like, oh, so there's 50% of the world who you could sell stuff to here. Would you believe it? And I think that's where sport is going professionally as well, because 50% of I have no idea what percentage of what the gender split is for people who go to watch sport, but it's obviously it's far more male than it is female. So Arsenal, I know, are endlessly trying to sell to women because that's the untapped market.
It's true. I was on steering panels actually for the FA back in the noughties when they were looking at really reigniting women's football, and they wanted to push it and they wanted to create a Super League, but they wanted to time it right. So they used to get together people from the media, from all sorts of media branches to discuss it. And they were looking at partnering with Tampax at the time. Actually, they were in advanced discussions with. That didn't actually happen at the end. But I was on a panel discussion with a man. I'm not going to name him, but he was an editor of a former lads mag, and his brilliant suggestion for what they should do with women's football was make it six-a-side, pop them in bikinis, and put them on a beach. Ideally, Casablanca, he said, but anywhere would do. To which I replied, "What, Bognor Regis?" He didn't find that funny. None of us found it funny either. But again, it contextualises how far they have come since then, because they launched the Women's Super League in 2011. Barclays have gone involved, sponsors are involved, left, right and centre. In fact, I checked. The Lionesses sponsors, some of them today are Nike, although apparently not for Mary Earp. They couldn't be bothered to make her a shirt. But TikTok and EA Sports as well, to name but two, and Zero as well. So the brands are there. They're getting involved, Ali, aren't they? And they're going to be so important moving forward.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's one of the things I actually am frustrated with, probably Sue as well, is that it almost took so long for people to go, the women exist and they play it and they're really good at it. And I think one thing that is central to that has been media coverage. I think it's really easy to hammer the media, but I think everything has to come hand in hand, and the media coverage of women's sport has been huge in promoting how wonderful a product it can be as well, and definitely commercial partners are getting more and more involved, and that has huge implications for, we talk about sustainable growth quite a lot for women's sport. We haven't seen it in men's sport in many ways. So let's take rugby, football. I think there's been massive problems there in terms of sustainable growth. It's a conversation that's had quite a lot around women's sport, and I think when we see these partners, I think it's the strategy or the pathway is then not only to elevate the very top, but it has to be a top to bottom approach to that. And I think you see quite a lot of that in terms of the commercial partners, that they want to engage with women's football across, I take football as an example, but women's sport across all the levels, because it's really important that the pathways are there and well supported to enable more girls to be able to access sport. I think the Lionesses doing the kind of statement around girls and PE is indicative, I think, of how important the top to bottom journey is for women's sport. I
think also it is that whole females influencing 85% of household decisions, purchasing decisions. I think that's the piece
100% in our house, I might have to say.
But I think that is the piece where brands are waking up to and recognising, and it's been amazing to see some of those brands coming in just to women's sports and women's teams, and not necessarily not just the female hygiene brands and but El Maquillage and some of the makeup brands, but some other products that are coming in and really focusing on the women's sports side too. So that's kind of really exciting. Yeah.
Oh, and I know you've got a story. One of the things that has happened down the years, a bit less so now, but it still does go on, is comparisons between men and women's sport. And I know you've got a story about the Brazil women's team in their time in Australia, haven't you?
Yeah, this was a really interesting one, because one of the aspects that many people are interested in is the comparisons, like the famous battles of the sexes in tennis, and people are interested in that, but a mature coverage of sport gets away from that. We understand that physically these are very different games, so we would try and move away from that. I think that's clear. When I was in Australia for the Women's FIFA World Cup, I came across a story which I found really interesting. I discussed it quite a long time with my sports editor about whether we should cover it or not, because it was it would cause interest in the right way and the wrong way. So in the build-up before the World Cup started, the Brazil women's team were based in Queensland, and they had a training camp up in Queensland. And they said to the Queensland Football Association, "Can you organise a last friendly for us before the competition starts proper?" And they said, "We want it to be a proper full-on game. We don't want it to be easy." And Queensland football thought about it, and they eventually put the Brazil national women's team against the Queensland under-15 men's team. So you can see already people are like, this is interesting, but is it right, and what do we think of it? So I can tell you, first of all, what happened is in the first half, the women's team were dominant. They were technically so much better than the boys that the boys struggled to get the ball at all. And then as the game wore on, the boys' physicality won over, and they gradually caught up with the Brazil women's team, and they won 3-1. So this is interesting for a number of reasons. One, I only stumbled across it because I was talking to someone from Queensland football when I was up in Queensland. So it hadn't been reported anywhere. The only way I could confirm it was when I looked on a Queensland football Facebook page, and they hadn't even put the score in. So everyone was being very respectful about the score, which immediately was interesting anyway, because it was like, oh, so we can't actually talk about this. Well, why can't we talk about this? Because it'll probably lead to a lot of people jumping to conclusions and go, oh, well, I told you that's how good it was, or whatever. But I said to my boss, well, if we write the story, people will say, oh, well, we told you that was the level of the women's game. I said, I know people will jump to that, but what's so fascinating about this story is actually the way the game played out is an exhibition of why there are two completely different sports. So you've got a technically excellent women's team, and then you've got a physically comparatively excellent boys team, and they're doing two different things. And when you put the two together, actually, does it really matter? But that's what this game showed us. And so we said, okay, let's run the story, and we ran the story, and it was interesting for a number of reasons. One, it was one of our most read stories, so the comparison thing, even though I think we should theoretically move beyond it, people loved the comparison thing, so I'm not saying that's good, but I'm just saying that's how people's minds work. And then the other side of it was, on the comment section below, you won't be surprised that we got lots of people saying, oh, I told you so.
White van man. I mean, that's the thing that makes me uncomfortable with it, is it just gives ammunition to those that whatever women do will always want to denigrate and compare with. I don't even know when that game was. That's always talked about. US men, under 15 boys will beat a women's team. So I like your nuanced reporting, but I imagine people don't read beyond the headline, and it gives them the ammunition to throw stones at women's sport. But
well, one of the things I do the most of now is tennis commentating, and it's a conversation that's come up a lot over the last 15, 20 years. You know, what rank man would Serena be able to beat? And it's such a tiresome conversation because it's just disrespectful to her ability as a woman. She's not the size of John Isner, who was 6'10" and could serve a kick serve for fun because he was gigantic and had longer arms and legs and greater upper body strength, lower body strength, you name it. You know, they're different sports. And that's part of the essence of this, making that distinction, but without making one of them feel lesser, which at the moment still feels like women's sport is always made to feel lesser.
And I think, sorry, I want to be here, in terms of the rugby, it is interesting talking to fans of rugby, and many fans of men's rugby actually loving the women's game when they get into the women's game and begin to know the players, etc., because they talk about, oh, it's almost like 15 years ago in the 1990s before men's rugby became professional and they're all 18 stone. You know, I'd love watching rugby, men's and women's, but it is that a different style of play, a looser, more tactical game, etc. So I think you're right. It's how do we educate people not to compare like with like. But a bit of it for me is it's almost like that continuum of there are primarily men that here that will always throw stones and be negative, and there's those that are completely allies and on board and they support and see the power of women's sport. And what we're trying to do is move some of those people in the curve more towards the embracing and understanding. I think the others, you've almost just got to not give up, but there's no point in wasting your effort on those. Let's bring others that are our fans along to women's sport.
So, Ali, I asked my 16-year-old son yesterday about women's football. Obviously, he's grown up with a sporty mum and a sporty dad, and a not quite so sporty sister who was never really particularly interested in sport, although she did participate. If he would enjoy watching women's sport regularly, women's football, and we're both Arsenal fans. Any more? Oh, there's a lot of hands gone up in the room. And I said to him, would you enjoy watching a women's match as much as a men's match? And he said he would. So then I said, would you enjoy it and pick it over a men's match? And he said he would not. And I asked him why, obviously, slightly passive-aggressively. And he said that it was simply, and he's right, what he's grown up with. So he's 16 now, so up until the last 2 or 3 years, regardless of me banging on in the background about women's football, he's obviously just been indoctrinated with men's football, understandably, and bombarded with it. So my question is, do you think in the next 10 or 15 years, maybe for 6-year-olds now, maybe a little bit older, maybe 8-year-olds, who will remember the Euros last year, will their answer in 10 years' time be different?
Well, I'm an optimist, so absolutely. I really think we will. I think cultural change is really hard. You see it like anywhere when we're talking about getting more women on boards or getting a greater diversity in different places. Like, that's not a quick decision that all of a sudden we've got 50% women on all sports boards and now everything's going to be gender equal. That's a process that takes time, and I think frustratingly for probably yourself, and we had this conversation before, for the women that have come before in that cycle that are so integral to the story, to the history, to where it is now, that hasn't come in that particular time frame. But we are absolutely going to have young boys, young girls growing up who are fans of Leicester City women, Arsenal women, and who are invested within that culture, and it makes sense to them. They go to the games, they know the players, they can buy the cool Stella McCartney Arsenal shirts that look amazing, and with I do think we're going to have that. I think the visibility of that, the access, the opportunity, the big stadiums, TV coverage, etc., plays into. I've got a friend with a little 4-year-old little boy, and he's a season ticket holder. They take him to Leicester Women every week, and he loves it, and he knows all the players, and he knows everything about the Super League, and that's what he does. He goes and watches Leicester Women, and that's his thing, and I think he'll continue to do that. I
feel unbelievably positive that will happen, and I think it's happening already. So I've got two boys, and in the last sort of 3-4 years, but particularly over the Euros last summer, when we were discussing this or how they were consuming it, there was not even the question of the comparison or how good is it or whatever. It was just an acceptance, and particularly my younger boy who's 20, he consumes whatever he can get, and he's never thinking that way at all. And I'd love to say that he's a representative of a whole generation, but that's what I see in him. It's not a question. He's not grown up with not knowing it particularly. It's just there.
Can I just jump in? I know we need time. The other thing I would say also is that those, I hate the whole is women, we need more women watching women's sport, because it isn't just women watching women's sport. However, there are more women and families coming to watch. So Juliet's on the Game Changers podcast, I should just flag, in a couple of weeks' time. But when I spoke to Juliet about the crowds coming into the Emirates for Arsenal women's games, 40% of them have never been to a men's game at the stadium. So it's almost that new audience that's finding sport, that then also might go on to find men's sport too, but they perhaps haven't felt that sport and fandom of sport is a place for them. They'll all be reading the Times before you know it as well.
Well, of course they will, obviously.
Get a subscription with their ticket. We've worked it all out.
A quick question for you, and I'll open to Ali and to Sue, and then open to the floor for some questions. How many women have you got writing about sport on the Times?
I wish you hadn't asked that question.
Or you give him a bit of heads up first.
No, we used to be the market leaders in that respect. I kind of think of it feeling, I'm kind of justifying or making excuses now already, because we're, as I said at the beginning, I don't think we're market leaders in this at all anymore. We used to be. I feel that the Times and the Sunday Times invented the coverage of women's rugby. Steve Jones was the first person who ever really did it. We started the Sunday Times Sportswoman of the Year Awards. So I kind of think we've got a history of doing this, but we have 3 women football writers out of, that's full-time. I think we've probably got 10 full-time football writers, so I don't know if you think that's good or not. And then we've got an increasing number of women who work on our editorial sports desk, but we're still very, very male-based, and if you looked at us compared to the Telegraph and the Guardian, we wouldn't be able to hold our heads up very high.
just finally, before we do open it up, Ali and Sue, I'll ask you the same question. The visibility of women in broadcasting and print media, covering women's sport, but also in administrative roles, that's also got to be key, hasn't it?
Yeah, women behind the scenes and producing and editing and directing and all those places too. So we do quite a lot of work with Sky, and you can definitely see that shift and an ambition to see that shift happening. I guess one of the things, I think definitely, I went to the SJ Awards last year, very depressing, shortlist after shortlist of 6 white men, 6 white men, 6 white men. And I was there with a couple of a young girl interns. I thought, God, how depressing to be in this room, and where's your future almost? It just felt almost so backwards into where I even ambitiously hoped it would be. So I do think things are changing, but it is about calling it out and having that discussion and for me, the coverage and Owen's comments about what's being covered, and I can't argue with the numbers and the stats that you've got in terms of who the readers are, but actually so much of it has to be, without doubt, who's making the decisions about what gets to print, what gets printed, what gets covered, who covers it. I was saying to Ali on the way up, I did have a little bit of research on the app, various apps before I came up, and I think it's about 10%, it's like 2 of 40 or whatever for the Times, for the Telegraph, for the Sky was like 2 in, not, even more. So sometimes I think you might have organisations that are really good at the top and they say that they're good, and the coverage, Sky's coverage is amazing, but when you look at the app, where's that connection? Who's making that decision? So I think it's having women across an organisation that can make it a difference too.
Ali, you're nodding furiously.
I am, yeah. Sorry, I've got my PhD student, Alex, is here today. Alex, just give us a little wave, Alex. So Alex's PhD is actually looking at women working in sport journalism, looking at the kind of the production of women's sport media coverage, and his work's really interesting around some of the challenges for women in these spaces. I think it's a really male-dominated space. Alex's research tells us it's really male-dominated, even when it looks not male-dominated, like behind the scenes, production, decision-makers, etc., are often still men in those positions. Now, this is not like a man-hating, bashing, women should rule the world speech, but
they should.
But obviously they should. But it goes back to the conversations or the points made earlier about who's making those decisions, whose voice is heard in those decision-making positions, who is able to put a viewpoint forward or to have those conversations. And I think it's never as simple as what you see. And even, as Sue said, even what you see, so I watched the Women's Super League on Sky Sports yesterday, but then me and Sue were looking on the app, and it's underneath Sunday League volley of the season and various bits before you get to the Super League coverage on the Sky Sports News app. So, yeah, there's lots of pieces to the puzzle, I think, of this, and it's not one quick fix.
Can I just say, so on that and the diversification or lack of it in the sports media, so on the first day of the Ashes test at Lords this year, I was, you may recall, about 2 days beforehand, or it might be even the day before, there was a report came out about elitism in English cricket, lack of diversification right across the board, classism, all this sort of stuff. And so my sports editor said something that was really obvious. He said, why don't you just leave the press box and go to the other end, to the pavilion, and go and chat to the MCC people, who are obviously as white and male as you can get. And so I said, all right, that sounds a fun challenge and a quite an easy entertaining read. So I went down there and spoke to them, and then I came back with a notepad quite full, and I wrote my piece, as I was writing it, I was looking around the room that I was in, and I was saying, well, and my conclusion was, well, is it really surprising that cricket's anything like this when all the people around me in this press room are exactly the same as that lot down the other end in the MCC pavilion? And it was completely the same.
It's a good point, which I think to open up the floor to some questions. I'm going to stand up because I've got a dodgy back. Alex is going to roam around you now. If you want to follow up on anything that you've heard in terms of the discussion, or you feel there's a hand shot straight up there, this young lady, you feel you want to ask the panel, any of the panel, please feel free. Hello.
This is directed at Owen, and also thank you all for your time. It's been a great chat. So I think you spoke a bit about the evolution of sports media and newspapers, and I think the newspaper industry is one that has evolved in different ways, with print changing to online, et cetera. But I think what you said around, you know, if the day after a match are women or are fans of women's sport going to read the newspaper about the recap or whatever. I'd be curious to hear about how you guys are assessing the type of content you put out and if it's written for an audience that would want to read it, or is it not going to be in print anymore, and is it going to be on social media and different content mediums? Because I think that's probably, it's not just we won't read what the Times writes because we're not fans. Is the Times writing something that I want to read about the sport that I'm watching?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what we're trying to master, if you like, because we know that a lot of the women's coverage of the Lionesses in the summer, that TikTok was going absolutely massive, and we're not very good at that stuff, you know. So maybe that's the direction we need to move in. So we're moving from newspapers onto online, and now we're understanding what people want to read online, and we've got a whole history of thinking we know what people who follow football like to read about, but we've got very little history of knowing what what this huge audience of Lionesses fans want to read about, and so we found out during the World Cup, because you get the numbers, we know exactly what people want to read about now. They want to read about stories, they want to read about profiles. The way we would traditionally introduce a big men's game, Premier League or international, we would do massive coverage on the build up to the game, and then massive amounts of analysis afterwards. And we're finding that actually those bits that are traditional staples just don't work. So we are in this whole learning experience at the same time as well, and trying to, you know, as I said before, there's this whole audience that would be brilliant for us if we could work out how to adapt to give it what it wants.
Very nice question. Thank you very much indeed. I don't know where Alex is. Oh, she's going down to the back, I think.
I was going to do another little plug while you're taking the question. Tomorrow on the Game Changers podcast, it's Susie Rack.
Is it your
from
podcast,
The Guardian?
Sue? Is it your podcast?
It is my podcast. But Susie Rack's on tomorrow, and it's really interesting in that whole, the growth of what The Guardian's done, and Susie is a real activist and talking about social purpose, and a lot of her stories have been, they're about the sport and these amazing athletes, but covering other stories within that too, and I think has been a big appeal.
And in fairness to the Times and the Sunday Times, I should say I started life as a print journalist for a year or so, when there were no women going into press boxes at all to cover football, apart from 4 of us, and Louise Taylor from the Times was one of them. So you would go into press conferences and you just wouldn't see a woman in a press box at all. So Louise was one of them, and I do remember her very well. She's still writing, I think, isn't she?
Yeah.
So props to her. Yes.
Hi. So I have a question that kind of came from the topic that Ali brought up around culture, but I think it's kind of for everyone. So one thing that I, and I'm sure other fans of women's sport, would agree on is I think it is really great at reflecting a lot of social issues and social values. So people talk about their gender identities, being parents, being queer, challenges around ethnicity and social upbringing or socioeconomic class. And I think that's such an important part of women's sport generally that isn't necessarily due to that transition from like amateur to professional. I think it's something that is very unique. And so I guess my question, there is a question here. So like from a media perspective, and especially a mainstream media perspective, what is the role of keeping that culture alive as the sport grows and as we are kind of on this precipice of massive growth?
Wow. Gosh. Absolutely. I think there's a few bits in there actually, so I'm going to attempt to unpick some of that, I think. And I think it actually follows on really nicely from what Sue just said about the work that Susie Rack has done, and other prominent often female sports journalists in telling those stories. So you're absolutely right. I think the culture of women's sport is one that has inherently been inclusive. Now that's not to say there has not been issues connected to women's sport. Particularly, we've seen lots of discussions about the diversity of the England women's football team, about the Arsenal football team recently. So it's not to say there are not issues embedded within the cultures of women's sport, but definitely it's been a space where these discussions have been had and women feel kind of safe in these spaces. The stories that the media tell connected to that have been really important. I'll tell a slight side note. Some research I was involved with that looked at the media coverage of women's football during the COVID lockdown. So the big discussion about women's football kind of dropped off the face of the earth. The Premier League carried on, no other sport carried on. And one thing that we found from that research, which we thought when we started doing it was going to be really negative, like there isn't any media coverage, was actually it gave a space for the media to tell these stories and for people, almost for people to be outraged at the fact that women weren't in, that there wasn't any football. So it just shifted, the conversation just shifted from these discussions about women's sport to almost like quite activist, like people were like, there is no women's sport, this is awful, and the media actually gave us space for those conversations. And I sometimes look back at that and think that was a really significant moment for the trajectory of women's sport in England, was the fact that people were so outraged at what happened in lockdown, that there was no women's sport. So that only happened, I think, and became part of the popular consciousness and popular conversations because people were writing about it. And to kind of complete the circle, or to go back on myself, the one thing that we kind of looked at when we did that research was that the people that are writing about it were women, and that it was really important for women to have space to write those stories, I think. And it goes back to the discussion about lenses and who sees what and how you understand things. And it was really significant that there were female journalists writing about football that had the opportunity to do that at that time. So I don't know if that answers your question, and if Sue wants to pick anything up on that, but in short, yes, the media plays a huge role in continuing to tell those stories. I think, as Owen said, these are part of the decisions that are being made about how do we tell the stories of women's sport, because it is different fans, it is different knowledge base, there's different history connected to it, and that's really important.
And I do feel, we don't just want women writing, female journalists writing about female sport and men writing about men's sport, but I do feel unless we have those female journalists at the table in the offices, then those stories won't be told in the same, they just can't be told in the same way. And so that's where that is so important, and seeing my little straw research of how many women there are studying on sports journalist courses right now, and that, you know, so how are we going to see that shift unless the media is openly looking to recruit and to recognise that they need to have more of those voices and opinions working for their organisations too, because it's just so important.
And I would add as well, I think it's a balancing act now with the success, say, of the Lionesses, that with the greater introduction of sponsors, you don't want the players to be less accessible. That's what Owen and I were discussing earlier, wasn't it? That the players, that they've had good relationships with the journalists up till now, because they've got so many requirements, media requirements, they become less and less available. We don't really want that either, do we? We still want them to be as available and visible as possible.
I think that's just that will be the nature of that. There will definitely will be some sacrifices. There were some athletes have shared some interesting things on football recently about there not being, in the past, fans turn up and everybody expects to get a signature and talk to the player and get a selfie and what have you, and that's fine when you've got 1,000 fans. When you've got 50,000 fans, you can't do that, and it's not really fair on the point was it's not really fair on the players to be getting beaten up for the fact that you're no longer accessible, when actually it should be the FA or the teams that are managing that process for them, because with the bigger fans they can't be as accessible as they are.
Yeah, sorry, but I think on that front, as we discussed earlier, one of the dangers that women's sport faces, or that could easily avoid, is it just follows the path that men's sport has set. So this is what men's sport does, and therefore this is what women's sport should do. So men's sport has a Six Nations rugby, so women should have a Six Nations rugby as well. I mean, that's just, not thought through at all. But in terms of media access and availability, I think it'd be really a brilliant thing if the Lionesses in particular, to use the most obvious example, made a huge effort to keep themselves visible and accessible to the media, because in men's football and in most men's professional sport, there's we're professionals and you're lucky to talk to us, and I think that that's a danger that again, it's probably on the whole, media officers around the women's team that decide, you're too famous to do this, but I think that's something that's a massive risk that could be avoided.
Thank you for your question. There's Alex down the back. Hello, yes?
Hi. On the subject of inclusivity and also the acknowledgement in the Queensland game that the boys or the males had greater stamina, obviously there are male and female differences. how is women's sport going to be affected by trans players, and also how's the coverage going to handle a very controversial subject?
It's a huge question, isn't it? A huge question to answer. I think that how will media cover it? I feel, and I don't work in the media as a journalist, I feel from the outside and looking at media, I think it's been a very hard topic to cover because the views are so polarised, and there's so much vitriol around either stance taken. So I think that makes it more difficult. So I definitely know some journalists, some media that have chosen not to engage and share as much as they might want to. I feel for fear of initiating that kind of negative response. And I think there aren't many topics in society at the moment that would instill that feeling either way. So I don't work in journalism, but even with the things that I would share or comment on, I kind of feel quite happy to share my opinions, but I'm always wary of. Even when the documentary came out, I was approached by a journalist, and I won't name the name, and I looked at their background and whatever, and I thought, I'm not going to talk to her about. She asked me about transgender women in sport, which isn't really covered in the documentary, and I thought I'm not going to go to her and talk to her paper because I know it's more nuanced than just and actually I won't be in control because she'll just take whatever she wants from what I say and paint me in a certain way. So I guess my view is not from a media perspective, but from what I've seen, I think it's a difficult, challenging topic. But you're in the midst of it, really, Owen. So I'm. Yeah,
I think there's two different things there. I think there's the question of how do the media cover the subject of transgender athletes and where they could or should be competing. That's a phenomenally hard one, and it's very, very polarising. And I think that most of the media would try and be as balanced and understanding as possible, in the knowledge that pretty much whatever you say is you can never please everyone at all, and you can only enrage people. So that's one side. But your question was, how will we cover transgender athletes in sport? So I think. If we're going a bit further down the line where I assume it's going to be more accepted that how and where transgender athletes will compete, and that's for federations and administrators to decide, not for us, but when they are in competition, I would imagine that there will be quite a lot of coverage because it's a pretty interesting subject.
Ali, do you want to dive in?
I think, me and Sue have had this conversation before. I think it's Sue and Owen speak to the divisive nature of this discussion, and this is something I can only speak from kind of an academic perspective. I've never written about or researched transgender participation in sport. I've got a couple of colleagues at Nottingham Trent who are heavily involved in kind of research with transgender communities and physical activity, all the way up to kind of discussions around elite sport, and it splits the academic community in half for sure. There's kind of physical scientists who are looking into specifics around performance gaps, all the way down to kind of a colleague of mine at Nottingham Trent who looks at the significance of being able to take part in physical activity in community. So it's, as Sue and Owen said, it's so nuanced as a discussion, and I think the media have a significant role to play in how that conversation plays out in popular circles.
Thank you very much for your question. Alex, you've got someone else down there. Hello.
Hi. I wanted to ask a question about the role of social media. So I follow a little account called Sports on Insta, and it just is a different way of covering women's sport and generating interest for the kind of attention deficit generation, if you know what I mean. And I think it's quite effective. I don't know if you think it's not like a 3-column match report. They're just little snippets of 5-second clips of a goal or whatever, and it's just quite fun. It's just quite a fun way into it, and I just wondered if you thought there was room for expansion through mainstream media developing that through their own social media accounts.
So really short form content then is what you're talking about.
Content.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I think that's undoubtedly where one of the many directions that media coverage is going, and that's, as you say, that's more a social media thing. But in the mainstream media, we will be trying to work out how to do that better. But what you're talking about is that there's often the teams, the clubs, the federations, the athletes themselves will be putting a lot of that sort of content out on their own, and I think that's where a lot of particularly new young audiences are accessing their sport. They're not wanting to read 3 columns, as you say, and so we've got to move in that direction to keep our audiences.
I think one of the things that's really exciting on the women's sport, and I'm hearing this more and more in various conversations with brands and other sports too, is that this younger audience that follow the players first, that love and loyalty for the players, especially in female sport. So player first and then team and federation and league and so on. So I think that is different to what we've seen. You see it a lot more in the US because they're less tied to a team that might be a franchise or might move about. But definitely that love and loyalty for female athletes who then are curating their own following through social media and sharing their content, and better tools available to enable them to share content too. So that's probably a whole other hour's conversation, isn't it? But it's an interesting piece, I think, of the how we celebrate and follow those female athletes rather than... And as a fan of women's sport, and I'm a fan of WSL, I don't necessarily follow one... Obviously, I'm an Arsenal fan, obviously. But I don't necessarily follow one team. I will follow players. I will follow a number of different teams, whether that's netball or that's cricket or that's rugby or football. And so I think there's hopefully some more research coming on how different a female sports fan is. Some people are concerned that I won't buy a season ticket and I might not buy the merchandise. And I might, if I'm not an avid, tribal fan of one team, but actually there's an opportunity, I think, for women's fans to consume women's sport in a different way.
And Alex, I think you've just handed the microphone. Hello.
Hi. Hello. Really interesting talk, thank you. I think this is more a question for the whole panel, but for Ali as well, I guess, because it looks kind of culture, and just what you said there, Sue, really ties in terms of the US versus kind of the UK European market. What lessons we could learn from the US? I mean, with the NWSL, the WNBA just continues, and it's rumoured that WNBA are about to sign like a $300 million broadcast, which you alluded to earlier, Sue, in terms of there being the free-to-air, the paid, and all the different levels. And I think it all ties in so well with the fact that, of course, as social media gets more and more serving for you, so I don't need to necessarily be following, but if I'm interested in, say, Mary Earps does, talks about fashion or something on her content, just because I followed something that's fashion related, it will actually come up on my page. So I think more and more it will become the fact that you'll have to start tapping into audiences kind of passively through general interest in those personalities that you've mentioned, Sue. So just again, what lessons we can learn from the States, and of course just to build on the success that we have had in the UK in the past couple of years.
I'll start, is that okay? So I think something that's interesting about women's sport in the US, so let's take the NWSL, so the soccer league, and women's NBA as the basketball league, is that I spoke earlier about, I think I'm like a secret historian, I spoke earlier about the significance of history and how we understand what happens today, and that both the WNBA and the NWSL existed in 2 forms prior to how they exist today. So there is a long history of the people connected to the WNBA and the people connected to the NWSL, of figuring out what worked and what didn't work and how to approach that as a business strategy, as a commercial entity, as something that's viable, sustainable. I think the WNBA started in the 70s and then it has had various iterations. Don't quote me on the 70s, so I'm not 100% sure. So there is loads to be learnt from that, because the history of kind of commercialised, successful elite women's sport has a longer history in America than it does in the UK, and the lessons that we can learn from that. So I think, I don't know if I've answered your question or just given more context to the question, but absolutely there's learnings to be had there. But I think what's important is that those things have existed for longer, and as we talked about cultural change being slow and how things shift and move, that takes time. I think the learnings for me from that is that we have to give these things time as well. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. It is interesting on the NWSL. So last night, Megan Rapinoe's last game, when I looked at my little research today of all those different media, I even read the Metro on my tube, no mention of that. For me, that's a momentous moment last night, culturally, for sport, for women's sport, for all that's happened. And Ali, it's her last game for Gotham, and
both of them the last ever games.
So amazing moment, but I couldn't see any coverage of that in any of the, and maybe that's because it's US versus, but I almost feel if it had been a male icon in that way, there would have been coverage of it too. That doesn't really answer your question either, does it? It's just a reflection that it's quite frustrating that maybe that's why I'm not looking at that media, because I went somewhere else to find that and see that coverage that I wanted. Exactly, that's where I saw it, yeah, exactly, where I went to find it.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
So I'm a Spurs fan, so I know we've had the Arsenal fan. I know, it's terrible. I can read every minor detail about Harry Kane's wonderful season at Bayern Munich, yet I can't find a single match report about Megan Rapinoe and Ali Krieger's last ever professional games. I think that is something that is inherently problematic with the media landscape of women's sport, I guess. This is a significant moment in the history of women's sport, as Sue said. It was huge. I can see it everywhere. My timeline is full of women's sport, obviously, so I can see it everywhere on my social media, and I can get lost in social media loopholes, but I can't read about it in global press.
I'm just going to send you to a clipping from the Times last week when we wrote a column about whether Megan Rapinoe was one of the top three. Well, we were saying she's one of the top three most influential footballers of the last 2 decades, along with.
So why did you not cover the game yesterday then?
It's in the paper today.
Is it okay? Yeah. Well, it wasn't where I was.
But there's a column that I'll send to you,
okay, thank you. We are good friends.
They are good friends, I promise. We're all friends. Listen, we've loved having your company. Thank you so much. I'm going to personally say, before we get some closing remarks from Peter, my thanks to Ali and Sue and Owen for a fascinating discussion and some fantastic questions as well. But I'm going to